Hi, I'm Gareth Green and welcome to the last video in our series Cool Extended Chord Progressions. So if you've not met the previous 7, doesn't matter, you can always go to those after this. They're not particularly designed in a progressive way, but each video is giving us a new spin on dealing with extended chords. So far we've dealt with extending chords to 7th, 9th, 11th, 13th. This is a bit of a mixture. We've got a 7th, a 9th, 11th and a 13th chord in just 5 chords. So I've managed to include an example of both. And also this time I'm talking about little chromatic alterations that you might want to make to chords as you go. So first of all, have a little listen to this chord progression. Okay, now you might think, oh, a couple of those chords are a bit more way out than we've had in the previous 7 videos. Perfectly true. Let's think about why that is, how it works, whether you like it, whether you don't. That's a very personal thing. So what have I done with the first one? C major 7 with a sharp 11. Oh, right, okay, what's all this about then? Well, C major, C, E, G. If I put a 7th, well, there's my B. The 9th is a D. The 11th is an F. So normally I would have that with an F natural, and I'd probably miss out some of those notes to make it sound better. But there's nothing to say that you can't use one of these extended notes to flatten or sharpen the note. So if I make that a sharp 11, it becomes quite a rich chord. And you see, it's almost kind of like a polychord. You get a C major chord and a B minor chord put on the top of it. But that is a C major 7 with a sharp 11. And you might think that's a better spacing than the one I've done. Doesn't matter. That's a slightly wider spacing. I've done one here that's quite close, where I've got E, F sharp and G next to each other. But you don't have to do that. As I say, you could do that in the way I've just described. Sometimes as well, in progressions, thinking about how we progress. So as I've gone from the C major 7 with a sharp 11 to the D minor, I'm preserving 7ths in the left hand there. Sometimes that's quite a nice thing to be able to do. And because I've got a kind of close arrangement of the notes there, I'm sort of keeping a fairly close arrangement of the notes here. So the D minor 9 chord goes like that. So you get a progression from this C major 7 sharp 11 to D minor 9 that goes like this. But if you prefer different spacing, see that F sharp feels quite dissonant, especially because it's a tritone above the bass. But having had those notes close together, to have the 7ths in the left hand going on and then to keep that close progression kind of makes that feel smoother, doesn't it? You don't have to make it smooth. If you want to start with that and then go, you could do that. Then my G13 I'm keeping as quite an open chord after the intimacy of the first 2 chords. Then the E minor 7 is somewhere in between, but returning to that 7th in the left hand. And then here comes the other one that you might think, oh, that's a bit wacky. A7 sharp 5, like, ooh, what's going on here? Well, A, C sharp, E, and then kind of doing sharp 5s. That's the F natural. You see how that's coming there? And that's why I've missed out the 5th. So you could say, well, doesn't sharp 5, shouldn't it be written as E sharp? Well, yes, I think theoretically it probably should, but actually in practice, particularly in this sort of style, well, if you're working in a more jazzy style, you probably just think, well, I'm going to call it F natural. It depends how it progresses as well, because if that's really heading for some kind of D minor chord thereafter, well, F natural makes sense in D minor, E sharp doesn't. E sharp would make sense if you were going to F sharp minor or something, but that's a slightly less likely thing to be going from there to maybe an F sharp minor, but you could be doing that. So enharmonics, whether we call it E sharp or F natural, is much more about where a chord is going, what the context of key might be. But so technically sharp 5 above A is E sharp, but in terms of what's the key context, you might decide to call it F, just to mop that one up. So you see what I've got here You know, just kind of using more extended chords, beginning to think about some chromatically altered notes within those chords. And this is intended to encourage you to think, well, can I do a bit more of this? You know, this second chord, for example, this D minor 9, sounds pretty cool as it is, but if you had a sharp 3 in it, you would have that. So it would give you a different kind of colour. C major 7 with a sharp 11, then D would effectively be a D9 chord, wouldn't it? So that would be a different way of doing it. You could do your G13, but there's nothing to say you can't flatten the 13th and get something like that. So it's kind of like experimenting chromatically with some of your notes, which is something we've not really talked about in the previous 7 videos. So we're still on this idea of chord extension, different spacings, different voicings, things you can do with it. But now we're talking about, well, what about if we do some chromatic alteration? And you can experiment with that. And some of the sounds you come up with will probably be fairly ugly. Others you'll think, hey, actually, I've managed to sort of really break out of the mold a bit here. And again, you could use this as a chord progression, put something melodic over the top of it. Depending on where you want to go. You could put something around the bass. Do a bit of both. Do something with the middle parts. Arpeggiation we've talked about before. Same things you can do. You'll come up with lots of other ideas as well, you know, that you can do with it. But it's kind of, how do we kind of experiment with these extended chords? Now thinking about the idea of chromatic alteration of one or more notes within the chord. How does that impact on things? How can I then build melodic ideas around those block chords, turn it into something that's more akin to a piece of music? Can I use this as a loop and go around it in different ways, elaborating around it melodically and so on? Or can I be inspired from here to move on and add some more chords that follow on? But trying to thinking about these extended chords. So I hope this short course has just been a little bit kind of stretching, a little bit kind of liberating, without throwing you into a place that you think this is impossible. Because quite often when you look at something using extended chords, you just look at something that's incredibly complex and you think, I would never be able to do that in a million years. What I'm trying to do is to say, if you've got some idea about how basic chords work, well, what could you do if you extend those chords and start to play with them a bit? And does that open up new vistas for you in harmonic imagination, for your composition, for your improvisation, for your playing, for your recognition of chords when you're playing other pieces? So I hope this has been a really useful little course in cool extended chord progressions. Well, if you've enjoyed this video, let me encourage you to take a look at the Music Matters website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. Lots of material there to look at, courses, the learning opportunities, maestros, merch, you name it, is all there. One thing that a lot of people talk about when we get into topics like we've been discussing is, well, it's great actually having all these chords, but I find it really difficult to hear chords. So if I hear a chord in a piece of music, how do I know what that chord is? Well, if that's you, have a look at our oral dictation course, because that sounds rather formal, but it's a very good way of kind of learning, how do I hear something and write it down so I can convert sound into notation. Loads of people have got a head full of musical ideas, no idea how to write them down. This course will really help you to do that. It's a very progressive course, starts with rhythm, then it just does single note melodies, then it builds up to 2 parts, 3 parts, 4 parts and so on. Gets more complicated with the harmony as it goes, having started in fairly straightforward places. So It will really develop your ear in a way that helps you to get the ideas out of your head and be able to notate them. And also the ability to look at a piece of music, if you're looking at a score, and think, I can hear that just by looking at it. I don't need to play it in order to hear it. I can hear it in my head. And that is an incredibly liberating thing for any musician. So have a look at that oral dictation course. If that's not what you're looking for, loads of other stuff there. So do go and have a look at the website, because there'll be something for you, I can guarantee it. www.mmcourses.co.uk